Welcome back, everyone. My name is Katie Fedosenko, and I'm the Manager of Sustainability Innovation at Tech and the co-chair of the Critical Minerals Council. At Tech, we produce steelmaking coal and a number of critical minerals, including copper, zinc, indium, germanium, and molybdenum. I come to you today from Vancouver, which is the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. Our next panel is on Canada's sustainability advantages and challenges. In this panel, we'll discuss Canada's comparative trade and development advantages, the ESG performance of Canada's mining sector, and how continuous improvement can support export and investment opportunities. I'm joined today by three esteemed speakers: JP Gladu, founder of Mokbate; Pierre Gratton, President and CEO of the Mining Association of Canada; and Sarah Fedorchuk, Vice President, Government and Public Affairs at Mosaic Company. We'll start today with an introduction of each panelist and what brings them to the critical minerals conversation. We'll begin with JP and then move to Pierre and Sarah. JP, over to you.
Thank you, Katie, for the warm welcome. Great to be in this amazing panel and great to see my friends on the panel today. I'm coming in actually from Kelowna, the Traditional Territory Westbank First Nation. I usually live on my own First Nation. I'm an Ojibwe, Anishinaabe from Northern Ontario, about 2 hours east of there. When Parents' team reached out to myself to see if I would engage in the critical minerals, I jumped at the opportunity. It's as the title says, it's critical. As a First Nation person, I sit on a couple boards. I'm an outgoing board member of Noront, if everything goes well with our deal. And I also sit on the board of Broden Mining, which is mine. We're resurrecting back up in the Yukon, and also a board member of Suncrest. We do actually mining as well. But to the critical minerals component, especially in this time in history, as an Indigenous person who's been very involved in natural resource development, I've seen firsthand from my grandfathers who were both, one was a logger, one worked for TransCanada Pipelines, building the TransCanada up in Northern Ontario. I've seen the positive, incredible impacts that can happen when you've got good, solid relationships, and you'll hear more from my esteemed colleague Pierre about TSM as an example. But I've also seen the ugly parts when you don't get it right, and it's an incredibly important part to our global responsibility to help the world achieve net zero. It's a big commitment in how we're going to get there, and critical minerals are an important part of that conversation. And then I guess lastly, just as somebody who is watching the United Nations Declaration, and many people are starting to understand that that's going to have significant implications in the way that we do work, I want to continue to insert myself as much as I possibly can to help bridge those relationships, help out wherever I possibly can. And again, it's great to see you guys and your companies doing this great work, and looking forward to this conversation. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much. Pierre, over to you.
Thanks. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin, and the recently freed city of the nation's capital. The critical minerals has been a reminder to all of us of where so much of what we rely on comes from. I think mining, it's out of sight, out of mind. People often forget that that of the old expression in our sector, if it wasn't grown, it was mined. So it is a reminder that so much of what we rely on and take for granted comes from the ground ultimately. And now we're facing some very significant challenges, both in terms of decarbonization, but also geopolitical challenges. And there's a tremendous opportunity in front of Canada if we do this right, to seize an opportunity to sort of lay a foundation for an economic development and an economic strategy that we probably haven't seen pursued to the same extent in many decades. We often look at MAC, we look at the critical minerals agenda in two ways, but in fairness to Sarah, probably three. First, there's the battery metals, of which Canada already mines and produces a lot: nickel, cobalt. Copper goes into electric cars in much greater volumes than your conventional automobile. Lithium, you name it. Those are the battery materials that we have already an existing advantage of. Then you look at rare earths, where we have one operating mine and it's new, and we have no existing supply chain, and we are starting from ground zero in a market that is largely controlled by China, and the policy responses to both of those are very different. So as we have today's conversation, we should probably think of it in those terms. And then of course there's potash, which is kind of on its own, but essential to keeping us eating and sustaining our lives in many different ways. So also a very critical product that Canada is the #1 producer of in the world, and Mosaic is one of the companies behind that. So it's great to have Sarah with us as well.
That was an excellent segue, Pierre. Thank you very much. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks, Pierre, for the shout out. Like Pierre said, I'm Sarah Fedorchuk, and I am the VP of Government and Public Affairs for Mosaic's North America business. And so that includes our Canadian potash business. And the entirety of our potash business is located in Saskatchewan. And so we have a real, I think, opportunity to really let the rest of Canada know that, you know, we've been blessed with this amazing resource right in the middle of the country. And I think the title of this panel is really apt and timely: the advantages, but the challenges and opportunities that come with being in the Canadian resource sector right now. For the potash sector, you know, we create 50% less greenhouse gas emissions than our global competition. We have a robust net zero target that we're trying to get to, but all of these, you know, sustainability initiatives that we've taken on come with added costs. And so I think that it's, you know, increasingly important to recognize that the Canadian resource sector is kind of leading the way when it comes to some of these sustainability and diversity initiatives, but we're in the commodity sector. And so when we're competing against, you know, Russia, Belarus, China, there's different, you know, layering effect of these that as a commodity based sector that we don't get a price differential from our customers globally. Not that we would want to operate in any other way, but it's definitely a consideration, especially when, you know, the market takes a bit of a dip. I think the other thing that, you know, we are not seeing now, but I think is going to be really important, is it's a huge opportunity as companies are looking at their supply chain and trying to figure out where, you know, their food's coming from and what the environmental impact of their choice is. We have a huge opportunity as the Canadian resource sector to really start to kind of toot our own horns and get out in front of consumers and really tell the story of, if you want a more sustainable, more environmentally friendly option, it's really here in Canada.
Yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much for those introductory remarks, and thank you, JP and Pierre. Let's kick off our panel, and we'll kick off with our first question, really to lay the current landscape of critical minerals in Canada. They're the building blocks of a clean and digitized economy, and the 31 critical minerals that we have listed are used for everything, as Sarah mentioned, from agriculture to defense to energy storage. When it comes to the current landscape for critical minerals in Canada, Pierre, you had talked a little bit about battery minerals, rare earth elements, and potash, but can you share a little bit more in terms of the current landscape in production and policy related to critical minerals?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I'll build on my opening remarks. If you look at battery minerals, or let's broaden it a little bit, but minerals and metals that are used for electrification, including electric cars. Canada has a lot of the building blocks already there. We have, first of all, we mine a lot of those products. But secondly, we process them and refine them. So we have smelters, including Techzone Trail Smelter, which produces a number of different products that go into these types of applications. We have smelters and refineries in Ontario and Quebec as well. There's a nickel refinery in Alberta. So we have a lot of the existing infrastructure that gives us a real advantage over other countries competing in this space, because they don't have that. They also don't have our significant mining supply and services sector that that supports this industry. We're the third largest in the world. They also don't have sort of our legal, our financial expertise. Canada is well known for being a leading mining jurisdiction. We have all of that going for us to start with that we can build upon. But there are some clear gaps. We don't produce, as I think the previous panel touched on, we don't produce nickel sulfate. We mine a lot of nickel. Our nickel miners have no problem selling their product, especially these days. But we don't produce the actual product, the chemical product that's needed in batteries. That's a gap we need to fill. We also, just to sustain our market share of the amount of nickel and cobalt that's going to be needed in the future, we're going to have to double our existing, the existing number of mines that we have. So there's a lot that we still need to do in order to ensure that we do in fact capture Canada's share of this new emerging industry, to say nothing about, you know, further downstream, the fabrication of cathodes, and ultimately, you know, the prize of a battery plant that ends up supporting the automotive sector. So, but we have some real advantages going into it. When you look at rare earths, I mentioned we have one mine in the Northwest Territories. There's this Saskatchewan Research Center is drawing some of those materials, and there's some development underway. But this is an area that is extremely difficult to penetrate because China really has control of that market. So it's forcing policymakers to think about, how do you develop an industry when you face such exposure, when you're competing against state-owned enterprises that can control the price of the product from one day to the next. It's a very, very different set of conditions, and it's going to require the government to think really hard about the kinds of policy instruments that have kind of been anathema, essentially government intervention in the market, at least in the short to medium term, to help build up an industry that can then survive on its own. So that's a very different set of challenges than in the battery space, where, you know, what can you do to incentivize one of our big nickel producers to start producing nickel sulfate and fill a gap, you know, from, you know, in a year? And what do you do to try to make sure that new mines come on stream and all of that? That is an easier challenge, not to say that it's a slam dunk, but it's an easier challenge than we're facing on the rare earth side. So those are the sorts of things that I think policymakers are struggling with. But as we heard from Minister Wilkinson earlier, I think what we're going to see is a sharpened focus. We've got 31 critical minerals, but it's probably unrealistic to think that we're going to be the dominant supplier of all of those. I think they're going to get laser focused, and I think they're going to think outside the box too, and look at some of those materials like metallurgical coal that haven't made the list, but that are also pretty fundamental to steelmaking, to automobiles, and the rest of it. Let's focus on where our advantages are, and build the next generation economy from there.
Yeah, can I follow up to that a little bit?
Please.
Yeah, that was really well, Stan. I just wanted to put, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but, you know, just to put a fine pin on that, and you look at Canada's competitiveness, one of our challenges is the certainty around EAs, et cetera, and the First Nations part in sustainability. But as an example, so my First Nation, we're on the eastern shores of Lake Nipigon. Rock Tech Lithium, to exactly what Pierre's point, they've got mine access to our reserve. We've got a good relationship with them. What's driving me crazy is they're going to take all that lithium and they're going to ship it over to Germany, where the battery markets are, right? And we think about all the lost opportunity to build relationships with Indigenous communities, to build that capacity, fill in the gaps that Pierre is talking about. But I also think there's this large disconnect between people, the markets, and our sectors, and GHG rejections and net zero. Because a lot of people talk about getting to net zero, but often when you ask them to put their money where the mouth is, and you can see these trillions of dollars that are amassing to support projects, but if you can't still get good returns, they're not going to follow it. So there's going to be a little bit of a disconnect until we get there. So in the example of China, I know they're state run, But at the same time, they're producing batteries, and they're GHGs, as we know, because they've got to use coal to produce all the batteries, and yet our world rewards that by buying into the supply chain. So again, there's this disconnect between people, markets, and where we're putting our money. So we've got policy is part of it, but it's also education and like, are we serious about climate change or not? Where are we going to put our money?
And really empowering the consumer to put their money where their mouth is. Sarah, anything that you would add?
I think just to add on, I think, over the last 2 years, we've seen how vulnerable supply chains are and how important it is to have domestic supply of things that we need. And for the first time in a lot of our lives, there's empty grocery shelves, used cars. People are selling them for more than they bought them for originally because the demand is so high. And so I really think that although there's these challenges, I think the critical minerals themselves really gives us this springboard to be able to have these conversations and bring light to why it's important to have a Canadian supply of these things. And to Pierre's point, are we going to have, be the world leading exporters in all 31? Probably not, but even to just incentivize the industry and support them and realize that it's really important, especially with some of the geopolitical things happening across the world right now, that we need to really champion our own industries.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's such a great setup for our next question. That connection from the mine to the processing to the consumer, that entire value chain. People are looking up the value chain to really understand the impacts that they're perpetuating through the purchase of products and the decisions they make when it comes to ESG. When we think about Canada's mining industry, there's some innate environmental and social challenges. At Tech, we're always thinking about decarbonization. We're thinking about water quality. We're thinking about engaging with Indigenous peoples and managing biodiversity impacts. How do you think that we can mitigate those challenges as we think about critical mineral extraction and processing while addressing those growing expectations from consumers and investors? We know it's only going to become increasingly stringent. What do you think are those main challenges when it comes to meeting those expectations? And maybe Sarah, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think some of the main challenges is really capital. I think there's lots of small, if we're talking about like huge capital projects that are going to promote electrification and carbon neutralization, and it does take a lot of capital. And a lot of our facilities are 50, 60 years old. And so a lot of the capital has been sparse, pursed out over decades. And so how do we really look at these older facilities and try to reimagine them and use technology to our advantage in a way that, we're still cost competitive? I think overall, some of the other ESG challenges are, with our Indigenous engagement strategy at Mosaic. I think it's something that we really struggled with for years and years and years, and refreshed the strategy a few years ago and had a lot more buy-in. And now we are seeing much more Indigenous representation in our workforce, in our vendor base, and our community investments and outreach. And so I think part of it's just deciding to do it. So we have like the capital, blocker to like some of the environmental improvements, but then part of it's just really forcing that kind of culture change internally where, and getting your leadership team and your workforce and local communities to really buy into the importance of change. And frankly, eventually there is going to be a financial incentive and benefit to all the changes that we're doing right now. And so I think that is, when you're beginning your journey, it seems like you're, trying to eat the whole elephant, but it's making those like small changes and really defining your path of how you're going to get there.
Yeah. Can I pick up on that Indigenous? And I know there's more conversation around it, and that was really great, Sarah. You're absolutely right. The thing is, you can decide to do it or not, and you're going to decide to do it well. And, just reflecting on I've known Suncor for years during my time when I used to run the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and to be on their board now. And they decided a while ago to do it. They cared, they believed, and they do it. And like, you got to care, you got to believe, and you got to do it. And like, we're approaching $1 billion in procurement spend with our Indigenous partners. We've got a $500 million+ East Tank project with 2 First Nations. We just signed a deal now with 8 other First Nation and Métis groups around one of our pipelines. So it's about building that in the capital pools, and we'll get into that conversation a little bit more as well, because on previous panels, how are we going to finance all of this in a country that's laced with so much uncertainty, not only domestically, but globally? How are we going to continue to attract that capital to invest in that 50 to 60-year infrastructure that you're talking about, Sarah, to remain competitive? And the Indigenous portfolio is a really significant part of that conversation.
Pierre, anything to add? Thank you, JP.
Well, I mean, just to build on, I think that the sector is recognized for a while now that you want to build a new mining project in this country, you're going to want to have Indigenous support and buy-in, and that means working early and often. And I think what's happened over time is there's been more and more sort of good examples of how this can be done, that the interest grows among communities that haven't had the opportunity and then do. And there's a lot more experience to go around in terms of what good impact benefit agreements look like, and how do you structure those. I think there's been a lot of lessons learned. Minister Wilkinson earlier touched on another piece that I think is also worth mentioning, which is, I think for the last 10, 20 years, there's been a tendency by governments to sort of say, okay, private sector, you go off and you bring us a project that has community support, and then things will go more smoothly for you, which is true. Mm-hmm. But they lay it all on the proponent and the community to solve. And I think that there's a role, and I often refer to my experience when I was at the Mining Association of British Columbia, when the government there introduced resource revenue sharing, where they committed to share a percentage of the royalty with the directly impacted Indigenous communities. And there's at least a half a dozen mines in BC that would not be operating today if that policy had not been put forward. It just changed. First of all, it was a sign of respect. It was a recognition that the land on which these mines were proposed, the resources underneath, were the traditional territories of the affected Indigenous community. So it was a sign of respect. It's also not an insignificant piece of revenue that you're going to get even before you conclude an impact benefit agreement with the company. And that's sort of the government saying, we're partners here too. And I think that there's, if we're going to succeed going forward to build upon our critical minerals industry, I think the governments are going to have to step up a bit more to help enable this to happen, to the degree that I think we need it to happen. If we have to double the number of nickel and cobalt mines and copper mines in order just to keep our market share, then I think governments are going to have to step up. And there's a really, really good environmental reason that we haven't touched on yet, but is worth noting. I mean, when I first joined MAC, we were the number 2 producer of nickel in the world. We're now number 6. Who's taken over? The Philippines and Indonesia. The carbon content of their nickel is 10 to 30 times higher than Canada's, because we have an abundance of clean power that they don't. So we do want more of these metals coming from Canada if we want to fight climate change. So we need to, there's an urgency and an opportunity that I think we have to face together.
That's, Pierre is reflecting on JP's comment about you got to care, you got to believe, you got to act. And I feel like that's playing shape forward critical minerals. Here we are, caring and believing, and the next step is to really act and to bring it home to Canada. On the discussion about Indigenous engagement, I think that's a really great segue to our next question. Mining's largest employer of Indigenous peoples and one of the most significant procurers of Indigenous goods and services. There's over 500 agreements in place right now, including many of those that we have at Tech between proponents, as Pierre you mentioned, and Indigenous communities. And when you think about it, the work that we're doing in mining with Indigenous communities is really the vanguard of economic reconciliation. JP, maybe to lead us off, how do you think the industry achieved this? And what do you think are the next steps to take us into the future when it comes to collaborating with Indigenous peoples on critical minerals?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, the mining sector has a huge role with regards to economic reconciliation, and how they achieve this. It was out of necessity, I think, at the beginning. For a long time, my people, we were lucky to get a few jobs if we were allowed to be, leaving our reserves to, all of a sudden becoming a strong supply chain and growing in sophistication, complexity, and depth across the country in all sectors. Which has been a fantastic way to build those relationships. So the industry came kicking and screaming at the beginning. So, building on Pierre's point about, government put a lot of responsibility on industry to do it. And the industry's like, okay, I guess we have to do this now. And, and I'd love to hear from my colleagues after this. And then my question to them would be, now that you've been engaged in those Indigenous relationships, do you care and do you believe? And I know you're acting, so you must be caring and believing, but I want to hear from you about that. So the mining sector has done extraordinary work, but we cannot be resting on our past practices. I mean, again, both Sarah and Pierre's kind of forecasted some ideas around capital pools. Government, I absolutely agree, Pierre. Government has a big responsibility, not just to, we're the fiduciary responsibility of the federal government. We're the only people in this country that are recognized in Canada's Constitution. But they have a big responsibility to also bridge the relationships, not just say, here, go do something. That those relationships are policy incentives, they're capital pools. As we talk about filling the gaps here, and we'll just use lithium as an example, and we're just going to send over the raw material for somebody else to process. Well, create capital pools for business ventures between Indigenous businesses and tech companies and the miners. They may not be really great at downstream development because they really haven't been doing a lot of it perhaps in North America, but let's partner all of us together to figure out how to solve the solution in a globally competitive way to reduce our GHGs. So, that's really important. And then the last couple of things I would say around, to my earlier point about the disconnect between people, markets, and the sector. I think the same thing is just about domestically and the Indigenous perception about resource development. It still puzzles me that when I see people on social media or in my circles that I'm getting introduced to, that they think we're opposed to resource development. No, we're opposed to the way that resource development. See, I've got agreement with the pup. He also agrees that the way that we did resource development in the past is not appropriate today. And so it's about that education piece and partnering. So I helped out the Indigenous Resource Network to help showcase the authentic Indigenous voice. We know where we got to go. We still have some significant challenges. We're going to be at the table, and some companies, I think, still kick and scream with us there, but we've got to figure this relationship out. We've got to empower that. Government has a really important role to do. And I've got much more to say, but I'll stop.
Thank you very much, JP. Sarah, Pierre, anything to add on and to respond to JP's question?
Yeah, I think that, I alluded to it before, but I think that, and, anyone from our leadership team would attest to this, that we really kind of struggled with how to go forward with our Indigenous engagement strategy. And then 5 years ago, I think we just, okay, if we're going to do this, we have to do this. And we have to actually, put a bit of our reputations on the line, put targets in place. What are we trying to accomplish? Actually start to do much more robust outreach on how we're going to accomplish kind of shifting how we've approached it in the past. And I'll say that, we had leadership buy-in, and it was really when we started working with our frontline employees. 80% of our employees are, going underground every day, or frontline employees. And so once we got the buy-in, I think from that, and started to get ideas from frontline supervisors on training and outreach, and it was really a game changer. But we did put, resources towards our goals and have been definitely making progress. But I agree. I think a lot of companies kind of struggle with where to start, or It's something we have to do. It's not something we want to do. And I think when you actually culturally make the shift, that's when you start to really see the progress.
I think what I'd add is to JP's question about, the continuing evolution of this. I think I could just, reflect on our Towards Sustainable Mining initiative, which JP mentioned earlier. So when we first started in 2004, one of our first areas, or what we call protocols, had to do with community relationships and engagement. And I don't think we even had, I should remember, but I don't think we even had Indigenous or Aboriginal in the title when we first launched it. A few years later, we changed it. We modified it. We had more of an Indigenous lens to it, which showed an evolution in our thinking. But then a few years ago, it changed significantly, and it's now the Community and Indigenous Relationships Protocol. And embedded in that is a recognition of UNDRIP. It's a recognition of the need to achieve free, prior, and informed consent. And we have criteria spelled out for companies to follow. Everything relating to training in cultural awareness and in the history of Indigenous peoples and the whole residential school experience is one of the things that is expected of you if you're trying to build a mine. That you not just look at employment opportunities, but you look to for a whole wide range of opportunities to partner on sort of environmental monitoring, on joint decision making. And as you sort of progress the ladder and you get to the highest levels of performance, we don't call it FPIC because there's sort of a recognition that it's not for us to decide or to say we've achieved FPIC, it's for the communities to decide. So we're actually silent on that point. But when you look at the sort of the criteria that are met at the highest levels, you've got a very, very strong, respectful, integrated relationship between the mine and the local communities. And TSM has really served as a guidepost for companies to follow. And it's really helped, I think, the industry progress and to continually challenge itself as thinking in this area evolves and as practices evolve.
Pierre, Tech is, as I'm sure you're well aware, we follow TSM at all 6 of our operations in Canada. They have that Indigenous Community Relations Protocol, but also a climate change protocol and a number of other protocols on critical ESG areas. And I think that for us, our TSM membership has been a core credential in talking downstream to the market about demonstrating our ESG practices and pushing us to continue to improve our performance as those protocols are revised. When it comes to climate change, that's one that you've recently added, and I think a really great transition to our next discussion topic. Sarah, you mentioned that Mosaic has that net zero commitment by 2050, so too does Tech. When you think about the international action on climate, how do you think Canada stacks up? Would you say that we're leading or lagging in comparison to others on climate action in the mining industry?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And I don't want to make it a competition, but our net zero is actually 2040, not 2050. So we actually
well done.
By a little bit. So we in December did release our net zero targets, which is 2040 globally and actually 2030 in the US. And before we released it, I think JP made the point before, I think people are, releasing net zero targets. I think it's great, but then what's the roadmap to actually get us there? And, many of our executives are not going to still be in place in 2040 or 2050. And so I think that one place that I think Canada is leading is we have, this really great, enthusiastic generation that's coming up where net zero targets are just like commonplace. And I don't think 10 years ago, new grads coming into the workforce would have even asked the question. And so I think that that's been really exciting. And then I also think where Canada is leading is how are we actually going to get there? And I think when you talk to a lot of the Canadian mining companies, they might not have, you know, all the nuances, but there's at least a loose roadmap of whether it's electrification or, you know, offsets or what have you, of how they're going to start making the path to net zero happen.
I think that's super critical to understand not only the commitment, but the roadmap behind it. And then the associated, and we've been going through this, the associated roadmap of technologies that are needed. And the challenge that we find is that there's a low technology readiness level on a lot of the electrification required, especially when it comes to mobile equipment. We had a recent announcement with Caterpillar for 30 of their 794s. That's not going to be until 2027. So you can see the amount of infrastructure required for electrification in the mining industry is going to be immense. JP, Pierre, anything to add?
Yeah, there'll be a little bit of lag to your point on that, Katie, for sure. As you know, at the Pathways Project, the oil sands companies, and I sit on the board of one of them. And to Pierre's earlier point about making sure the government's at the table, that's a powerful combination. I think the best suited organizations in the country are the ones that have strong balance sheets, deeper pockets, and operational experience. And if you can tie that with the technology providers, and you take like any of us in our financial portfolios, you're going to have your safe bets, planting trees, and you're going to have your moonshots. You have to be looking at a portfolio of opportunities to reduce the GHGs, so the emissions. So I think Canada's on a good path, but we've got to measure, we've got to monitor, and we've got to adjust, and we got to track that capital. That's a whole nother conversation.
To be a bit more optimistic, well, not that my colleagues are being pessimistic, but I'd like to, this is an area where I've just seen a massive acceleration in the last 5 years across the country in the adoption of sort of clean power. Whether it's, mills with, an entire solar wall to reduce reduce diesel consumption, whether it's some fully electric underground mines because the equipment there has developed sufficiently, whether it's the introduction of trolley assist at open pit mines that the industry would not have contemplated 5 years ago because it would have seemed too expensive. I just see it accelerating at an incredible pace. And that's what gives me some optimism, is that, to Katie, to your point, not till 2027, but by 2027, I bet you there's going to be a lot of other things that you're not even aware of now that you're going to be able to deploy, because this is just accelerating so rapidly. And that's what gives me, cause for optimism. That I think that there are rapidly emerging solutions for the electrification of mining around the world. We're not operating in isolation. There's a lot of really interesting things going on in hydrogen here in Canada, in South Africa, in Japan. We're all going to be sharing this amongst ourselves, and I think we'll see more and more rapid deployment. Whether that's going to get everybody to net zero by 2050 or 2040, I don't know. Obviously, we can't know that, but I am truly amazed at how quick things are being adopted and implemented now, just over the last 5 years.
I just want to jump on that, and I would agree somewhat with Pierre about how quick. But the one example where we didn't, and we lost a massive opportunity, is our LNG. That's 30% of emissions versus coal. And look at India and their commitment. I mean, you can't begrudge these countries because energy is fundamental to life. And we missed the opportunity. And I can get into the whole thing about the US setting up their blockades for us. Now they're pumping out all their LNG out their ports. But that was a big we got to get better in Canada
Yeah.
getting these things done quickly, because by the time we think it's a good idea, the world's already passed us by.
Yeah, and that's the biggest risk we face in critical minerals.
Yeah.
That we'll do a lot of thinking, and meanwhile other countries will be building.
And that,
Well, when it comes to the speed of development, we heard Minister Wilkinson talk earlier today about how it takes an average of 15 years to have a new mine come into production. He talked about and shared some thoughts on how we could potentially accelerate that. He said we should focus on 3 things: doing Indigenous engagement early on, being thoughtful at the front end on how to mitigate environmental impacts, especially on water and habitat of endangered species, and working towards federal, provincial, and industry alignment on the assessment process. For the 3 panelists that we have here, what's your perspective, building on Minister Wilkinson's thoughts, on how we expedite project timelines, attract investment capital, and maintain that high degree of environmental and social performance as we accelerate production of critical minerals in Canada? Maybe Pierre, we can start with you.
Yeah, that is certainly probably the biggest challenge we face, I think, in terms of achieving our objectives. The third part, it's really on him and his colleagues. There's one agreement in place between BC and the federal government on substitution. Where are the other jurisdictions? Why can't we come to some kind of coordinated, at least a coordinated or harmonized approach on impact or environmental assessment? We've got to do a better job of that. To say nothing about, as we move towards, Indigenous-led assessments, we've got to be, the last thing, there was one project I remember in northern Quebec, near the border of Labrador, and it was facing the prospect of a Quebec, a provincial, a federal, and 2 Indigenous-led environmental assessments for one mine. Can you imagine? We've got to do a better job of integrating and achieving one project, one review. At the front end, we've already talked about it. It's a given, and I find sometimes when I hear that said, it bothers me a little, because it almost suggests that we don't do that. Whereas, of course, we do that. One thing that's a given, the reason why it takes mines so long to come into being is, first off, the exploration process to determine whether or not you've got a resource that can make it as a mine. You're talking many years, and you're talking many years under the provincial system and provincial permitting, which has required the development of relationships. So no project enters the impact assessment process without established relationships, because they've been on the ground for years already. So that's sort of a given. Now you can do it badly, and some do, and but you don't have to. There are lessons to be learned. We've talked about that already as well. There are good ways of doing this. Companies know how, and those that don't can find out from others how to do it well. So I do think that, and what was the third piece? I think that was a very interesting point about, and it's particularly relevant when you look at certain regions of the country, like the Ring of Fire, an undeveloped part of Ontario, largely undeveloped part of Ontario, with a tremendous opportunity, and a tremendous opportunity in the critical minerals space. Makes a lot of sense to do it right. And there's a regional assessment that's proposed for that area. Let's make the most of that. Let's get the information we need. And to his point, have one road with some side roads as opposed to multiple main roads, that would cause all sorts of problems for the boreal caribou and other species in the area. If you segment segment the wilderness too much. We've seen that with oil and gas development and so on, where there's just too many lines, too many cut lines, too much disturbance that causes risks for a number of different species. So if we can avoid that, that makes an awful lot of sense to me.
Thanks, Pierre. Sarah, JP, anything to add?
I think the only thing I would add, I mean, regulatory certainty is really important for companies, and a lot of mining companies that do a lot of business in Canada are becoming more and more global. And so I think ensuring that companies have a really clear path to getting permitted and getting approval, and some sort of assurance that if they are doing it right and are doing the right things, then they eventually will be able to, operate. And because I think 10 to 15 years to build a new mine, but mines are usually built for 50 or 60 years. And so it's a long game and it's a long view. And I think it's a huge capital investment for companies that are often publicly traded and have a duty to shareholders. And so giving as clear a path and regulatory certainty as possible is important.
The only other thing that I would add, and I'm really grateful because 10, 15 years ago, and I've been at this for 25 now professionally, I wouldn't be hearing my colleagues talking about Indigenous issues or hearing a minister talking about Indigenous issues as point number one. But just to level set expectations, that's a lot of pressure on us to get it right. And we've only been a part of the economy largely for the last decade or so, decade to 15 years. So the broader economy has had a lot of experience and lead time, and we've got some catch up to do. But it doesn't mean that it can't be done through innovative relations, but you gotta have those relationships. So I'm just really grateful that this conversation now is at the front of the table and not at the back. And we've talked about that already. So.
Well, JP, you're a living example of what's changed. I mean, you sit on boards now.
Yeah.
And you have colleagues, there are many other Indigenous leaders that do the same. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that.
Well, Mel Benson was the first. Yeah.
Pardon me?
We lost our dear Mel Benson as my predecessor at Suncor, but 21 years ago. But that was way ahead of its time.
That was way ahead of its time. But we've seen a lot of change, and I think we'll continue to see a lot of change. I made one observation at a conference I was at not a few years ago, but when I first joined the sector, if a project was blocked in court, say, because of a failure to consult, the industry, would rip their shirts and swear and curse and attack the system.
Indigenous leaders actually in jail.
Yeah, and they'd attack the system and they'd say Canada's broken. Today, there might still be some people who do that, but today, mostly the reaction from industry will be, oh, what did they do wrong? They better go fix that.
You're right.
I mean, that's sort of like, oh, a mistake was made. They better go fix that. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of how, that's where we're at, I think, today. It's just sort of, there's a right way to do this. And if you don't, well, go fix it. Yeah. And if you can't fix it, well, then, that's too bad for you.
Move over, somebody else will.
That's right.
Well, I'm really sad to bring our conversation to a close. I saw we had one question on Slido, and I had a final question on international markets. So I might just take the opportunity to meld the two together. That was a really lovely question. When it comes to pursuing investment from international markets, building a name for ourselves as a nation, what are your thoughts on a Canada brand when it comes to critical minerals and position ourselves to capture and articulate those ESG advantages we talked about, relationships with Indigenous peoples, working towards net zero by 2040, 2050, and all the good work we do to address the social and environmental concerns in mining? Maybe JP, I'll start with you.
What do I think our brand is? I think it's strengthening for sure. I mean, we've always been seen as a really great country, but we're not seeing the rewards, the best place to, like, gender equality, Indigenous relations, regulatory, all these things, but we're not being rewarded in the market. So I'm wondering how deep that sentiment goes. And that goes back to one of my earlier points about the disconnect between people, markets, and our sectors. But I think I don't think we've done enough to leverage the, and again, since I'm the Indigenous person in this committee, I'm just going to finish off with that. ESG is so important in this world. We haven't figured it out yet. We haven't figured out how to incentivize. I think it was you, Katie, that said, our senior executives aren't going to be around by the time the targets that we set are going to be around. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around it. We just need to be cognizant that it must be cross-functional. And the same thing with the I. Do not put the I, and I've had this debate with my Indigenous colleagues. I don't want an I in ESG personally, because everything just deal with that over there. It's the same way government's dealt with us for a long time. I is in every part of that. And I is the environmental, the Guardians program that Valerie Courtois runs, exceptional. Have Indigenous people leading the process. We've talked about that. Have us reclaiming the land. That was a question on one of the earlier panels or ours, I forget. And the social, a lot of the social ills are going to start to come into focus, and we'll be able to address them better because we've got economic reconciliation. Then lastly, around the governance, thanks Pierre for the shout out. There's incredible Indigenous leaders, just to name a few. Nutrients got, I think that's Keith Martell. Chemicals got Don Derringer. RBC has Roberta Jameson. TD has Sherry Brandt. TELUS has Sean Willey. So for people listening in on that, you cannot give me an excuse that you're not at least having Indigenous people on your green list, on your evergreen list, because having Indigenous people on your boards, and I can throw you a whole list of them, is only going to serve. And look at the most recent ICT journal, please, online, or if you get it. I'm an ICDer myself, and I just appointed to the ICD board, so I'm really passionate about governance.
Thank you very much, JP. Sarah, Pierre, anything to add?
I think what I've seen as someone, whose background is public affairs, I think a lot of the individual minerals are doing a really good job of marketing themselves. So for example, the potash sector, we have, a campaign called Time to Dig Deeper, where we are talking about economic impact, social impact, and kind of environmental track record of the Canadian potash producers. But I think where we have a real opportunity is the big umbrella brand, like, the Made in Canada. And, we have a great international brand as a country with, that's very politically stable, that is, very thoughtful, leading edge in so many ways. And so I think if we kind of all get moving in the same direction, we can definitely brand our resource sector kind of with that. And I think that we already do have a great reputation, but how do we really maximize it the next 5, 10, 15 years as people are really kind of looking for companies that have a great ESG track record and have minimal environmental impact and are doing all the right things.
I love that idea, Sarah. Someone who comes from public affairs myself, I see a lot of opportunity there. Pierre?
Katie, I just add that, I think it's to be watched. We have a number of initiatives out there now. Responsible Steel comes to mind, the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, our own Towards Sustainable Mining Initiative, Drive Sustainability, which is a large group of automakers, setting expectations for the mineral sector. So if that in fact does lead to purchasing choices, then I think Canada will emerge with a real strategic advantage. Whether that leads to a premium, I'm not sure, but it might. We don't know. But it's a rapidly evolving space. But, if you listen to BMW, it sounds like they want to make sure that they buy their materials from responsible sources, where you can demonstrate that, in fact, it was done responsibly. That requires proof. That requires initiatives like TSM and others that you can actually, show them. Yes, we do it this way. So I think watch this space. It may turn out to be a real advantage. And there's the other point that we've touched on, but that should really be emphasized. Our abundance of hydro and nuclear, non-GHG emitting power, and a growing renewable sector it is also a real advantage in a carbon constrained world. You can buy nickel from Canada with a fraction of the carbon compared to other parts of the world like Indonesia.
Yeah.
So if people want to start making those choices, they're going to look to us. Now, that also doesn't you also can't avoid the fact, though, for us to continue to do that, we're going to also need a lot more power generated. Like, we won't be able to, if we're going to supply more and more materials, we're also going to need more power. So that's a whole other conversation that the chamber probably needs another panel for.
Well, it sounds like a great lead off for the panel and for the chamber from here. You know, the three of you have shared some really lovely final remarks, but I just want to make sure that you have at least another 30 seconds to add any final thoughts before we wrap. And Sarah, let's start with you.
Yeah, I want to really thank the chamber for giving us the platform to just talk about this. I don't think that the sector, tends to sometimes not tell our own story in a really overt way at times. And I think part of that's kind of the mining sector, and part of it's just being Canadian and not feeling like you want to be out with everything we're doing right. But I know that Mosaic's very proud of the work we do. 40% of crop yields are directly attributed to the work we do, and we need to really make sure that we're telling that story.
Thank you, Sarah. Pierre.
Yeah, no, I think the sector's really come a long way in 20, 25 years. I think we are leading in many respects. I think we still, but we work in a sector that's tough, and I still think we have some major challenges ahead of us. One topic that Minister Wilkinson mentioned that we haven't really touched on all that much is diversity and inclusion. Beyond Indigenous peoples, where I think we've made some real progress, but we are still a very male-dominated sector, and notwithstanding two of you not being male on this panel, and notwithstanding the fact that my own board looks much different today than it did 20 years ago, we still have a ways to go. And if we're going to truly succeed as an industry, we're going to have to change how we look and how we operate in more ways than we've discussed today.
Thank you, Pierre. JP?
Yeah, I'm a proud Indigenous Canadian, and you know, I'm grateful for the country that we live in. I think we need to stop being a little bit. I think we don't have to be Canadian all the time. And this goes back to the time pressures that we're facing. And let me just put a pointed spear on this. If we don't learn from the experience that we're just hopefully coming out of in this global pandemic and our capacity to produce vaccines, we're in the bottom of the list. And it's the same thing with our minerals. If we don't develop the capacity, we're going to be on the bottom of the list again. I don't want to be there. That's embarrassing for a country like Canada. We're already there on a number of issues. So it's not an emergency yet, like we were a year and a half ago, but it certainly is urgent. And we need to start treating it as it's urgent. I don't want to be in an emergency again.
I think it's a really powerful message to end on. JP, Sarah, Pierre, thank you so much for your time and your participation in this really fabulous discussion on critical minerals and Canada's sustainability, advantages and challenges. I really enjoyed the discussion.